Welcome, everybody, to today's Praxist Table Talks. My name is Vincent. I'm the founder of our group and the ideal of Praxism, and today we're going to be talking about the political principle and the topic of politics itself. And I have with me today a member of our leadership council, Cody.
Hello, everyone.
And also returning, we have Goji with us.
Well,
how are you guys doing today?
Pretty well myself.
That's good to hear.
been better.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
I've been worse too. So,
all right. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. But so today we're going to be discussing politics, not necessarily the politics of the day by like engaging in a time-sensitive political conversation, but more so the Aristotelian capital P definition of the word politics. Or when I brought this up, Cody, you referenced it as the art of politic, as akin to Sun Tzu's art of war. And I think that that's a good way to phrase the topic of the day, because it really encompasses the idea of what we're going to be talking about, which is the political method, and especially the function of politics in the Kali Yuga. And I'll explain what I mean by that later. But really the attitude with which we, from our more holistic praxis perspective, suggests to have when approaching politics. So what this conversation is really going to boil down to is really hammering out the praxis / capital T traditionalist / proper political function, as well as discussing different political philosophies from the ancients to modern times, and maybe analyzing a historiography of politics and identifying perhaps where we went wrong and what to do to rectify that. So does anybody have any opening statements before we kind of jump in?
I guess to introduce that catch-all of the art of politics, I guess it's apt to call it that because of Aristotle's splitting up of what he called the sciences and natural philosophies, and how rhetoric was something that he akined towards the arts and other such sciences, while politics he divvied up into another categorization itself. But we see today in much of our modern political body that rhetoric is the domineering force in persuasion, especially of the masses. And there is a certain artfulness and a certain manipulation or depiction of our reality through politic that is very relevant and very similar to how great minds like Sun Tzu wrote The Art of War, or even modern figures like Donald Trump has books titled The Art of the Deal. And there is a certain art to all of this in painting the picture of human nature and how we necessarily interact with each other, and how real the capital P politic is in the very foundations of our beings, which people as far back as Aristotle and even before him kind of recognized and brought down to that scientific analysis.
Yeah, it really is, because human nature really is a political entity in itself. Not so much as people today would view the word politics as some kind of like I said before, like a time-sensitive hot take type of thing, because politics as a concept is so much more than that, right? It's the maneuvering of the social world. It can be as small as a tribe, and it can be as large as, these multinational entities that we see today. Politics is really the navigation of that world, and how you play politics is really kind of a analogy or a metaphor for how you, in a sense, maneuver that world and get into positions of power that you think you belong into, and other things like that.
Or what demographics in society ought to be in power, and so on and so forth.
Yes, exactly. So things like castes and everything like that is a very good example of that. But I think, I guess to introduce the topic on a broader scale as well, we have, I guess, the political principle as a thing that exists beginning with multifamily civilizations and tribes. So everywhere from ancient tribes in Northern Europe and Western Europe and things like that, or places in like Asia, even as far as North America. All of these groups that had multi-generational and multi-family civilizations, even if they were small, had a political element to them, in the sense that there was an authoritative holder of temporal power. There was a economic factor. There was a priestly religious factor, and there was a communal factor as well to it. And there has to be this balance. It is said to be a balance between these various not forces, but these various entities that kind of manifest in the proper form of politics. And maintaining this balance is, I guess, what you could say is the art of politic, as you have put it. So with that out of the way, I guess what I would jump into first is the idea of the caste system and the idea of politics in the Kali Yuga. Because when I reference that, that really means, from whenever that age is said to have began, which is probably around recorded history, up until now, politics as a principle has been through various changes. It's gone through, a bunch of different stages in throughout history. And so I guess we can kind of outline this as a historiography as well, to kind of start this out. But, you have in the beginning, let's see. For example, the beginning castes were said to have been, or the beginning political structure was said to have been this traditional primordial proper structure, right? With the with all the castes in alignment, the age of the first caste, so to speak, the sort of androgynous and regal mix of spiritual and temporal power, and that was said to be in prehistoric times. And then coming after that, we have directly below that the passing of power to the warrior caste, which is more in recorded history. It comes along with the Roman Empire and the medieval ages and things like that. And then after that, you have the passing of power from the warrior caste to the mercantile class in the early modern period. And then from then on, it has gone down to even the fourth estate, which is more so like the masses, the communal entities, and things like that, which can be very easily manipulated by media and things like that. The fourth estate is really the newest iteration of the stages that politics has undergone. But we can use this as a reference because we can use that primordial time as a reference to what politics should be. The references of various mythologies of ages that had certain divine kingships, like for example Asgard or Olympus or these other solar figures who reigned over pretty much everything, right? Even in Christianity, you have God, who is the king of the world, and then the king of the universe, and then Jesus as the rightful kind of king figure in the world. So that's these ideas that we can kind of look at and say, okay, well, this is our frame of reference. This is our point of reference. We can reference these as the proper forms of government, and then we can abstract from those the various principles that come along with them, such as the representation of heavenly power on earth through like Jesus and things like that. And using that as our guide, I think we can kind of look into the various sources we have here with us today, because we have a lot of different sources that we're pulling from to kind of analyze the political sphere and hopefully come to a conclusion as to what direction we should be facing when dealing with the political question. Because I guess one last point I would make before I kind of pass the mic on to someone else is that in our age, there seems to be a this is more of a phenomenon of the previous generation that existed around from 1990 to 2010. That used to be the main attitude of this generation, but it still is prevalent today, of an apathy towards the political. And this can be in the form of a hyper-religious secularism, which kind of sounds contradictory, but I can kind of define what that means later on, or a very atheistic secularism, which kind of comes into a more so I don't care about what happens, a very individualistic outlook on life. And both of these worldviews that disregard the political for something which is intrinsically linked to the political principle they're misguided, to say the least. And so I think that at any rate, we need a direction to be able to head in. When we can't just kind of look the either way and not care one way or the other. We need to play the political field. Maybe not so much by engaging in party politics and engaging in the political paradigm that's set up before us, but by playing politics with our own entities that we have, our own businesses, our own personhoods, things like that, our own families and communities and things like that. So I think that's the kind of direction we're going to go in with this episode.
Absolutely. And to piggyback off of where you just left off, I'd say not only can we not ignore the body politic that is our contemporary sphere, we can't surround ourselves with illusion either. It is very easy to get caught up in fanciful utopianism and different aspects of what ought to be instead of what is. And as idealistic as humanity tends to be in our conceptions, we still always have to deal with the shortcomings of ourselves individually and our societies as a whole. And that's what this episode will focus on as well, on making sure we're grounded in the reality of our limitations while still going for those aspirations like we've spoken of with Novus Civis and things like that in our doctrine. Bringing that back around to the conceptual aspect of spirituality and religion, like how we have with the Kali Yuga or with Christianity and God and things like that, you could see that religion, at least from a psychological perspective, is the manifestation of politic in ideal, where there is supreme authority in this divinity. And divinity is an aspect of human nature that is most detached from our physical reality, but still an aspiration and a necessary force that's always there. It's the hardest to kind of define and grapple with, and which is the reason why people end up, like Vincent said, becoming that apathetic and atheistic type of person that just ignores spirituality altogether, mainly times because they don't have the intellectual capacity to really grasp these concepts, or they're just too limited by their earthly vices to give it any consideration. But it is rooted all within that authority. And I think authority is the sort of axiom on which all politic works. And I guess we could get into that right now if you want to back and forth on that.
Yeah, sure. I actually have Rene Guénon's text of spiritual authority and temporal power opened in front of me right now. And
perfect.
Yeah. So he opens it. I actually think that he's got a good opening. He says, throughout the various ages of history, and even well before what are conventionally known as historical times, we find clues of a frequent opposition between the representatives of two powers, one spiritual and the other temporal. And this option can be discerned despite the social forms sometimes assumed by these two powers in adapting to different circumstances of time and place. This does not mean, however, that the opposition and the struggles it engenders are as old as the world, so to speak, as this much abused expression would imply. such would be manifest exaggeration, for all traditions teach that in order for this opposition to arise, humanity had to reach a phase quite distant from the pure primordial spirituality. So that's kind of like the idea of keeping the what he references here with the primordial spirituality and this unification of the spiritual and temporal power is that type of primordial political principle that I mentioned earlier, with that reign of the first caste, that ideal, like you said, it's that utopian ideal that various traditions have taught about through history. And so as he goes on, he kind of talks about how there was a split between this. So he says, in short, caste distinction, along with the differentiation of social functions which correspond to it, results from the rupture of the primordial unity. Only then do spiritual power and the temporal power appear separate from one another. This distinct exercise of these two powers in turn constitutes the respective functions of the first two castes, which are the priest caste and the warrior caste. And there has been, ever since, I would say at the very least, recorded history, probably way longer, there has been this divide between who should rule, right? Should it be the more earthly warrior principle based caste, or should it be the more philosopher king, or the more philosophic based priestly type caste? And I almost got ahead of myself right there, because Plato kind of rectifies this in his idea of the philosopher king, because this is kind of a reunification of these two principles, which have a divide in them in the form of, spiritual authority and temporal power. Plato suggests that there's this idea of the philosopher king, and he suggests this in the book The Republic, in which he outlines, or maybe no, he doesn't outline, that was Aristotle who outlines, but he suggests this in the book The Republic, which talks a little bit about the various forms of governments, and this is the book in which he has the analogy of the cave, which I think we can talk upon a little bit later as well, because it's a very eye-opening analogy. But this idea of the philosopher king is one which kind of presides throughout various mythological interpretations and various utopias, and it manifests in these various ways corresponding to the time period in which it takes place. So you would have, well, I guess, except for the fact that this philosopher king instead becomes it becomes increased in quantity in the necessity that it is needed. And so what I mean by that is essentially with the regression of the castes, you see this ideal of power is delegated more and more decentrally, in a sense. You have with the primordial spirituality, you would have that philosopher king, and he would be at the top. He would be the pinnacle of the hierarchy, so to speak, and he would have this regality to him, and he would have ultimate authority. And for this to work, you would only need, theoretically, one good philosopher to be in that position. And then as the castes have kind of regressed, you see this passing on to the warrior caste. There are a lot more warriors than there are these regal people. So the necessity for philosophers becomes a lot more. It becomes, you need to have, instead of one person who is capable, you need to have 5 people. And as it passed down to the merchant class, there are many merchants. And so for politics to function properly, you would need every merchant to be a philosopher. And now as we go into this fourth estate, more communitarian type of sentiment that we have, with the individualist movement and collectivist movement, which are kind of two sides of the same coin, if I'm being completely honest, is, we have this idea of the collective rule, or the will of the people. And what this requires, especially in the form of a republic or a republican democracy, or even a democracy, is for every citizen to kind of be a philosopher, which was kind of the utopian ideal of the Enlightenment. But obviously it's not the case now. What it really manifests as is people being kind of manipulated by different propagandistic sources and stuff like that. But what are your thoughts on the matter?
Well, I guess that harkens back to that labeling of utopia, where correct me if I'm wrong, I think utopia translates from Greek to nowhere, it's a place that doesn't exist, essentially, and that's that utopian vision you just mentioned of the Enlightenment being everyone is a philosopher that can live in more or less a state without need. Like there's a post-scarcity type of society, which is a lot of what communist idealism tends to go into, which an unfortunate red pill that everyone kind of needs to swallow is communism is a natural, logical progression of the liberal Enlightenment values that that was kind of bred out from the Enlightenment.
Oh yeah, I would even go as far as to say it's a result of a materialistic worldview, because as you kind of orient onto the pleasures of people,
it's an involution of the liberal idealism of the 17th and 18th centuries, but that all kind of wraps around to that point of authority, and where these earthly bodies and institutions have been devolving from the authority that they once held, if they held any at all. Like we keep mentioning with the fourth estate rule and the fourth generational warfare, and everything has to be propped up on lies and disinformation and misinformation, and the applicable use of violence and force is very scarcely used, because I forget who the philosopher was, or the intellectual, I believe 20th century, had the allegory of foxes and lions, where there are certain types of rulers in society, and the lions are usually like the warrior / philosopher king of old, the bold sort of natural leaders that can rest on their authority and on their virtue, as Aristotle might put it.
Right.
Whereas the foxes are more persuasive and rhetorical, and because they don't have the physical disposition of a lion, taking the allegory most literally, they'd use trickery more to their advantage, which does have a stemming in authority, but how it's played out in this fourth estate type of rule is more or less disastrous, because it crumbles the foundations of any authority there is. And what I kind of touched on there is that old Stormship Troopers quote is, "Violence is the ultimate authority." And while that is true, it is not the only authority. And I believe it was one of Plato's students as well, not Aristotle, but one of his other students, that brought up that question about the Philosopher King on, well, what if someone's just stronger? What if you just take something by force and declare themselves king by force or ruler by force?
Right.
And Plato didn't really have an answer for that. You wanted to add in?
Yeah, it's so...
You have to also remember that that's essentially how every nation on Earth was founded.
To an extent.
Yeah, to an extent.
We'll get...
Yeah, especially in the beginnings. I think a good example of that would be the colonial empires of Europe, around the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries. You could see that these great powers were founded on some type of violence. Let's see, kind of going back to what you said about Plato's ideal of the Philosopher King, and when he kind of got asked about it and said, well, what if someone gets taken over by a more powerful strongman, so to speak. That's kind of what we've seen, and there is a lot of debate that goes around the circles of philosophy, which is should the strongman rule. And the reason I think so many people say yes to this, and because I found myself saying yes to this, as like when I was younger, is because I guess when I was less philosophically inclined as well, is because the idea that we have, the archetype of the strong man, is that warrior type aristocrat, that strong man that you would see, like, the Japanese, what are they called? The God, how did I forget this?
Shogun.
Yeah, and the idea of the samurai as well, and like the idea of the chivalrous knightly lord, right? And the other ideas that we have of strong men who mythological heroes like Beowulf or like like Sigurd or you name it, King Arthur even, right? You have these different mythological heroes that were strong men. And so this becomes an archetype that becomes translated into, popular culture and all of that stuff. And people, take this to heart, and they kind of base their opinions on what the strong man is based on these archetypes. And so if this were the case, and every strong man was like this, obviously, yes, the strong man would be the proper ruler, and the weak man would not. But
I think there's an important distinction, though, too, or in addition to that. And I don't know if you're getting to this or not.
I think I am, but go ahead.
Yeah, it's the definition of what strength actually is, and if it's just a barbaric use of force and exerting your will on others regardless of the consequence or benefit to yourself or society or those people you are forcing that will upon, and that threat of violence, there's a definite disunity there, and it is something that Aristotle and many other philosophers touched on the consequences of that in, like, say, a slave-master relationship.
Yeah.
And it's those men of the mythological framework that were not just strong in the sense of physicality and in the acquisition of violence, but also in the wisdom in knowing how to use it. And wisdom is that other area of authority in which I wanted to get at, which is where the fox stems from. Whereas these men of what Aristotle would call virtue are just that. They're virtuous. They embody all aspects of authority and the application of such that is good and just, not just for themselves, but for the whole of society. And that's why they rise above the rest to be these rulers or kingly figures or men of mythological status, like Beowulf or Achilles or King Arthur and so on.
Even real life figures like Caesar to an extent.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So, but yeah, I was kind of getting to that because you do have these all around sound individuals being the archetype for the strong man in popular culture and in people's minds. And I think a lot of the doctrine of the strong, or the more Darwinistic approach to morality and to the propriety of leadership, I guess I'll say it, because I'll get into what I mean by that as well. It really comes from this idea of the strong man actually being the strongest man. But if you kind of abstractify that into principles, what you're really saying is that the principle of physical strength should always triumph over the principle of morality and virtue, because strength doesn't necessarily equal morality and virtue. It equals strength, and it is more so a tool to be directed by various actors, I guess, if you would call them that.
I think this is shaping up to be like a really interesting conversation, especially since I come from the almost complete opposite side of the spectrum here.
Yeah, I remember having that conversation with you. But in a sense, yeah, because we have this idea of the strong man. But what happens when the immoral strong man becomes the top dog, right? What happens when the weak men bind together and overpower the strong man, which has happened? This is the reason for
we have now.
Exactly. This is the reason for the regressions of the regression of the castes and stuff like that, because you had this one Philosopher King strongman who was overpowered by the warriors, who were then overpowered by the merchants, who were overpowered by in certain cases even the masses, the laborers, and various socialistic revolutions and things like that. So obviously strength is not the moral reference point, so to speak. It would be morality, and this is why with the Praxis philosophy, even, we have developed this idea of propriety, which would be the alignment of imposition and spontaneity. So it would be the spontaneous alignment of a lesser principle with its function, if that makes sense. So like, it would be because there's the idea of free will that we kind of touch upon with the various religions and things like that too. which kind of shows that we do have a certain control over our actions and over our thoughts and things like that. But it's what direction we take with that. Do we align with our function, with the function that we were kind of predisposed or preordained to serve, or do we choose to kind of walk away from that path? And that idea of walking away from that path, that's kind of what is the driving force of life. It's kind of the driving force of at least physical reality. It's that ability to deny that proper path, that propriety that we talk about. So the idea of propriety, I use it with a capital P because it kind of denotes a specific function, a specific unity of a form with its function. So that's why when I said when I introduced the episode, I introduced it as that we would be getting down to kind of the proper political function, because politics does have a space, it does have a spot in the kind of hierarchical spectrum of reality of the various principles, but it is now and has been for a very long time being perverted and kind of misused in a certain sense. But with the idea, I guess this is a long explanation to kind of answer the question that you asked at the very beginning, Cody, was what's the reason that Plato doesn't have an answer for that? Well, it's because the idea of the Philosopher King is the proper idea, but with the way that our physical reality works, it might not be the idea that wins. So just because it's the right way doesn't mean it's the way that's going to win. And so that's exactly why he doesn't have an answer, because at the same time, there are these proper alignments that we should be making, but what does rule out in the physical world, in our reality, is strength. So that's why I think the doctrine of the strong comes along so prominently to a bunch of people, because it really levels the playing field. It levels the idea of morality down to the victor, if that makes sense.
Oh,
Yeah,
absolutely.
absolutely.
That's how it works.
And I think I do remember this conversation we had a while back too, with Goji's positioning on strength overall, and there was miscommunication that I remember as well, which hopefully we'll avoid this time. It does harken to that point I made on warning about avoiding illusion and avoiding the what ought to be instead of what is, because that's what happened to Plato. There is, he was caught up on what ought to be, and as justified as he might have been in that positioning of the ought, the reality was that if sheer force of will can just overcome it, then there's no real way to avoid that conclusion in our physical reality. Only exceptions to that might be some figure of divinity, like, say, Jesus Christ, where his physical body succumbed to the force of will of this temporal world, and he was crucified and all that else. But because of his godly divinity, transcended that physical form and was revived, more or less, and walked the earth again despite physically dying and being subject to that brutality of force and violence. That is the only real way to get around that conflict of the ought and is, and that's why I mentioned that spirituality and divinity and that transcendent state is the hardest to quantify and relate to on a human level, because it genuinely takes a figure like Jesus Christ to transcend that temporal reality in which everyone else exists on.
I think that so that's why I call it that's a great segue into this, but that's why I reference this as politics in the Kali Yuga, because if things were this way that they were thought to have been in this mythical era, right, we wouldn't be having this conversation, it would be the way it's supposed to be. The Kali Yuga is identified, characterized by a regression of the castes. It is characterized by caste strife and warfare rather than cooperation. And so, in a sense, this idea of politics really only matters when it comes to an age such as ours, where everything is malleable. It does regress down to the doctrine of the strong, and it could be because maybe these there's talk of spiritual virility and whatnot, and of the physical capabilities to maintain the power as that proper figure, the Philosopher King. It could be because the Philosopher King did lose that hold. He did lose his strength. He lost his virility. And so the idea of the Philosopher King succumb to something that was more physically inclined, but less well thought out, less intricate. But I this is kind of going off onto a tangent. But I watched an interview with a guy named Angel Miller. I've referenced him a few times. I watched this interview a while ago, actually, but this just reminded me of it today. Is the idea of he has a book out called The Path of the Warrior Mystic, which is about being a man in an age of chaos. And in one section of that book, he kind of identifies the warrior as not someone who can just be the strong man, but someone who is those King Arthur types, those knightly chivalrous figures, those strong men who are the archetypal strong man. And so I just thought that was an interesting tidbit here. But kind of going back to the discussion at hand, I kind of want to reference Plato's analogy of the cave and Aristotle's different forms of government. But to kind of wrap up with the discussion about the Kali Yuga, so the Machiavellian principle, which I will be referencing later on as well, also comes with the imposition of the Kali Yuga, the regression of the castes and everything like that. Because I do think that this principle would not be needed. Like I said before, we wouldn't be here discussing this if things were, hunky-dory, as it were. Anyways, does anyone have any kind of things to add before we go on?
No, I think the
I did, but analogy. I forgot it.
The cave analogy, though, I think that's good for the fourth estate ruling of today.
Yeah, that's true. So I guess for people who don't know, right, the cave analogy is this analogy where people are in a cave. Imagine a cave, and there's a flame, and people are tied with their back to a wall, and in front of them is only a cave wall, and behind them is a flame which illuminates the cave, and in front of them are shadows being kind of manipulated by a certain actor or force or something. It could even be a person. But in a sense, the people who are tied in the cave, the people who are stuck in the cave, their only reality is what they see in front of them. They are shackled to the wall, so they can't go anywhere else. All they know is the cave and what is in front of them. And so to them, the shadows are real. What they're seeing is real. What they are told is real, because that's all that they know. And so the analogy kind of deepens as the one who leaves the cave is considered to be the philosopher, right? The person leaves if a person leaves the cave, he's blinded for a little bit, but then he starts to see these other things around him. He starts to see, that reality is not just the cave, that there's something bigger out there, that there is a way more of a more holistic world, that it still needs to be understood, but that the cave is just an illusion, that someone is someone is tampering with the flame in front of the flame to make shadows. So everything they thought that they knew was incorrect. and the philosopher is the one who has escaped the cave. This is the experience of, kind of. I guess it could be referenced as like the experience of initiation in a certain sense, right? So then, the philosopher he kind of goes down that path, and comes back to the cave and tries to convince the other people to leave the cave, and the other people are calling him crazy because they think that what they know is real. Because it's in front of them, they think that is real. They think that the shadows are real, and this guy's just crazy because he's not telling the truth. And this is kind of what he calls the philosopher's burden, or the philosopher's duty. It is the duty of the philosopher to return to the cave, to engage with the people who are still shackled there, to try to convince them to come with him. And so that kind of translates into... it translates into a lot of things, because it can be, it was in the Republic in which he referenced it, so it obviously does have political connotations as well, with the philosopher being the leader out of the cave, right? The guiding force out of the cave and into a more holistic worldview. But it also has apolitical kind of connotations that we don't need to really indulge here. But go ahead.
I can... Yeah. That allegory of the cave, which I imagine most people should have known by now, especially with all that's happened in the past 10 years or so. But the re-explanation is important, because it's necessary to point out the shackling of the people in the cave transitions from physical bonds of subjugation to this metaphysical bondage of convincing yourself that the only reality there is to know is the one being projected on the wall in front of you. And that's much of what's seen today with the fourth estate mind control of the constant influx of propaganda and media and imagery and sensory overload to the population, to have them be pivoted one way or the other. And it's most apparent, you can see in real time, with how the previous narrative has almost been completely forgotten about, and the new narrative that's being pushed most stringently with propaganda constantly being constantly assaulting our eyes and ears because of these deeper connections to things like the global American empire and other geopolitical influences here and there, with all the finances and everything else that has become this amorphous blob of oligarchy that's ruling over us now, has a vested interest in shifting the narrative away from what's failed to what they might be more familiar with in war. It was just fascinating that people could get so spurred up over something that didn't involve them in any way, didn't affect them in any way, unless they were told about it, to be told that they had to care about it. And that's essentially what is being in the cave. And then all the people outside of the cave pretty much see that, oh, this is just bullshit. But it's getting those other people out of the cave that is harder than just using those rhetorical devices and trying to convince them. Sometimes it does necessarily mean using force to overpower those who might be subjugating or chaining those people in the cave, the masses, and just ripping them out of the cave and throwing them into the world. And it might be a catatonic shock to some of them, but for most, they'll necessarily be better off if they can see the light of day instead of just the dim light of the fire projecting shadows onto the wall.
Exactly. And that's kind of why, the doctrine of the strong has some validity to it in that sense, because the idea of kind of overcoming with violence and being the ruthless but still just leader, the Philosopher King type that does have the strength to take them away from the wall, and to throw them out into the daylight, even symbolically, that is a good ideal. So I can see why that idea is so prominent.
It's like the relationship between a parent and child too, where a virtuous leader acts in the interests of their civilization, But if the populace might be on a self-destructive bent, as is the case sometimes, like we see in our modern society, in people's fixation with things like social media or pornography or things like that, it'd be the job of a virtuous leader to limit or expel those things and necessarily discipline the population, and discipline in its truest definition, like a parent would discipline a child, so that the child isn't just an invalid or completely rebellious to the forms of how to function as a self-sustaining person. And that's kind of the relationship there in a very rudimentary sense.
Right, and the suggestion of that today is almost kind of a lot of people would consider it out of order because the doctrine of egalitarianism especially is such that no man is qualitatively better or qualitatively more disposed to rule than another man with the same credentials, the same accomplishments. Even if psychologically, personality-wise, even metaphysically, in a sense, with the various castes and things like that, they could be completely different, but they could have walked the same path, And with that, like, it's kind of like how we talked about with the last episode with how we have this various on paper qualifications that don't really gauge whether a person is fit to do something, just so much as they have the previous history and everything like that. It's kind of the same idea with the political principle, and having the rulers actually need to be the disciplinaries of the populace, which would be absurd to suggest, in the least, because like I said, the egalitarian notion is such that a ruler would not even should not have the audacity to act in such a way. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. It's kind of the philosophy of what do you mean you want to ban things? Why can't people enjoy things? It's that sort of libertine philosophy of vice that's been ruling society for so long within the minds of men themselves, not even through any external force.
The whole idea of you don't have the authority, or no one has the authority, or all that is so pervasive that it's the main barricade in the way of the right thing being done, essentially. Mm-hmm. You can't get it done just by convincing them, because they are totally and utterly convinced that everything is equal, nothing means anything.
That everything's qualitatively the same.
Everything's equal, and they won't listen to someone who just tells them like, "Oh yeah, I have the authority to say no. Like, don't do that."
Yeah, and that's why I brought up the parent-child relationship too, is because
to keep them in check.
Yeah, the parent is there. I mean, naturally, the parent is there because child, but philosophically, in a sense, is meant to be able to limit the child's, I don't want to say instincts, but
desires.
It's more or less.
Yeah,
to keep that.
It's more or less like the child sees something that they want, and they're like, "But I want it." Yeah. The parent has to say, "No, you can't have it."
Right. It's that same idea, but the thing is, the parent is qualitatively superior to the child because they've just had more time to develop. I like to use the analogy of the classroom as well, where if a classroom was a rule by the fourth estate, you would lose the teacher you'd lose the homework in the first election, you'd lose the classwork in the second election, and you'd lose the teacher in the third, and you'd have this mess of students who don't know what to do. That's the same idea with leadership as it is today. And like I said before, the idea of having a leader who has the audacity, so to speak, to impose that type of discipline onto an undisciplined and very materialistic and swayable, what's the word? Not inspirable, but it starts
Incorrigible?
No, it starts with an I.
Incorrigible?
No. Regardless, someone who takes, someone who is easily manipulated. In that regard, that's what is characteristic of the populace as of now, and so someone who is able to kind of capitalize on that, and be the guiding figure, is almost seen as an immoral person, even if he is trying to guide them in a moral way. Even if he is trying to be that philosopher king, nobody wants to listen to him because of this idea that, who are you? We are all the same.
That's what I wanted to mention too.
Because for them, the morality, the ultimate morality, is what is freedom.
Right.
Yeah,
And
it's that inversion.
Is morally bad.
That's why I said it's this libertine philosophy. It's this inversion of what people consider tyrannical, which is what Aristotle once made with his distinctions of the 6 forms of government. The
I think
tyrannical
that's a good
side of things, and the whatchamacallit, the just form of politic.
kind of what we would call the proper form.
Yeah. And what we see today in our political leadership, even though we know they're not really those in power, is they're all just so timid, and they act completely on the basis of the whims of the masses and the re-election and poll numbers and things like that. And
well, that's also sorry
yeah.
to interrupt, but that's also why you've seen this transition from the third estate to the fourth estate. You know, because you also you have this rule of the mercantile class, and even the elected leaders, which I would still consider as members of the third estate to some degree. You have this transition to the masses because there has to be this mass appeal now. Like you said, there has to be this appeal to the numbers almost, and so there's this idea
a rule of quantity.
Yeah, exactly. The reign of quantity. Exactly.
Reign of quantity. Yes.
But yeah, so that's what I'm saying is that this inversion, this involution into the fourth estate has taken has taken form and has manifested because of the necessity to pander to the numbers, pander to the masses and give them what they want, even at this very moment. And you know what's funny is that this is kind of reflected, so to speak, into the parental world as well, where parents are giving in more and more to the desires of the children. So it's not just on the meta scale that we see this happening, but we see the materialistic disposition, the materialistic desires become so strong even in an early age that and even on such a small scale that you see it kind of reflected there. But and I
had just a little more to add before we move on. And it is that opinion of the masses that is swaying the political leadership that we have now. This what should be the aristocracy of our republic, but is now the oligarchy of it. And whereas the masses are controlled by fear most effectively, that narrative shift is changing from where I was going with that. The masses will abandon principle for security, whereas the oligarchy would abandons principle for money. And that's what we see now, especially where a lot of these people are bought out and traded with different pressures from different monetary institutions that get them elected and get them their power. And it's that idea of this oligarchy being bought out that has washed away any virtue from the ruling class. And this is where we need, I guess, more or less a Caesarean figure, because the rule of one can cut through the many, because it's the organized principle that rules the day, where 1,000 men with a vision and a discipline can outmaneuver and outfight 10,000 men that are just an amorphous mob, and that principle applies very much so to Caesar. And the issue now is that all these people in the avenues of power of society, this fourth estate, are also timid. They are that fox, and they refuse to do anything out of virtue, because once that does happen, the entire establishment of the fourth estate will turn on them or will crumble, and they'll lose their power. And it's that quote by Hesiod that goes, "Both gods and men are angry at those who are idle," and that applies not only to those who have the necessary power, but those who should be striving for it, like us, who are more or less idle in the ways of how things are going, and we need to start forcing those necessary changes with whatever authority we have.
Right, and you know what? That's exactly why I've been stressing that, people need to play politics, not necessarily by engaging with the current political paradigm, but by taking action in their own lives, by making themselves the best politician, so to speak, making themselves their own ideal philosopher king, by understanding. And when I say that, I don't mean to assert yourself according to principles that are essentially hollow in substance and essence as well, but to learn and to carry truly an open mind, a mind that is open to a mind that is open to things that most people in the modern day would not consider as even a consideration. So that would be, like this idea of the philosopher king itself is not a consideration. The idea of religious rule, or the idea of divinity and all of that, is not a consideration. So when I say open mind, I mean do keep an open mind to craft your knowledge and hone your knowledge and hone your craft, I guess is the best way to put it. And then with that, you can play politics pretty well, in the sense that you are able to articulate what it is that you support and why it is that you support it in a vacuum, so to speak. I was actually going to read this quote by Guénon, and he says, "Knowledge par excellence, the only one that truly deserves this name in its fullest, is knowledge of principles, independent of all contingent applications. And this belongs exclusively to those who possess spiritual authority, because there's nothing in it deriving from the temporal order, even taking this in the widest sense." And so that's kind of what I mean here, is that to obtain a certain amount of knowledge, you must be able to think abstractly and be able to formulate your opinion without using the current circumstance as a kind of a framework to work upon, but by using it as supplementary to your worldview. And if you do this, you will likely arrive at a worldview similar to ours. I feel that truly, because it's just so, like, when you consider a holistic interpretation of reality, there are so many things that need to be considered. And as you kind of learn these different things, you start to put the pieces together. And that's where I think a lot of people are on this path, path to, I guess you could say, leaving the cave, right? Leaving the current paradigm, the current modern institutions, the current modern narratives, and finding their own. And obviously some might walk into another cave, and some might, decide not to leave the cave after all, or might unshackle themselves but never actually get up and do the work to leave. But I think that those who truly walk our path, who truly seek enlightenment in the actual holistic and true sense, the proper sense, those who truly seek enlightenment will find it. And I think that one thing I would say about our worldview, as the sort of the Praxis worldview, is not that it is one that is written or thought of, but one that is discovered through learning. That's kind of an aside. But I guess one last quote to substantiate that would be Confucius, where he says, "In order to make the natural virtues shine in all hearts of men, the ancient princes first of all applied themselves to governing their own principality well. In order to govern their principality well, they first restored proper order in their families. In order to establish proper order in their families, they worked hard at perfecting themselves first. And in order to perfect themselves, they first regulated the movements of their hearts." And so that's kind of what I am referencing here. But kind of going on from that, because we are about an hour in, and I kind of want to move the conversation along to a little bit of a different topic. So you brought up those forms of government that Aristotle talked about. Do you kind of want to give an explanation? Because I have a chart in front of me that I could explain, or if you want to do it, you can feel free to do that too.
Sure. And I also wanted to piggyback off what you were saying right there too, on those who seek enlightenment will, and those who wish to stay in the cave will as well, and that kind of gets into the natural dispositions of some men in the castes that they're kind of born into, more or less, which justifies these different forms of government or of politic, I guess, because those interactions dictate how society functions. You want to go over the forms first or the castes first?
I think we can do castes, and before that, I actually want to reference what we've kind of the path that we've taken with Praxism as an idea, because what we've done is we've taken these various principles that are observed in different societies, and we've kind of abstractified them, and we have taken a look at what they are at their core. And one thing that I see, humanity likes to categorize things, right? Humanity likes to put things into certain boxes that fit together. But Frithjof Schuon, I believe it was, made a good distinction in saying that, I believe it was him. I can't remember if it was him or not, to be honest, but I think it was him. He made a good distinction in saying that very obviously people who are of the same caste are different, just qualitatively, and by virtue of being different people and by existing within different circumstances and things, and so they exist on a range of things. They exist on a type of range rather than in specific categories. And so I take this one step further. We take this one step further with Praxism, and it's kind of not necessarily categorical castes, but a range of castes that have different categories within them. You know what I mean? So there can be overlap between the lowest form of a warrior and the highest form of a merchant, and the highest form of a warrior and the lowest form of a priest, and things like that. There's this overlap there. Yeah. And so I think when talking about castes with us, since we're so abstractly speaking, we're speaking only in principles, it's good for us to not define castes that we would explicitly say are correct, but to kind of identify the different castes on that spectrum that different societies have touched upon. And the same thing with cosmogonies too, but I won't get into that. But just as an aside, I putting a mental note. But for example, the Hindus had 4 castes. The Greeks had 3. Different, like the European societies had about 5. And so all of these are different castes that existed within their societies, but the fact that there are multiple numbers shows that range. And so I just kind of wanted to preface with that before we get into these actual castes, because when we reference these different castes, we might reference 6 or 7, but there is a lot of overlap in those 6 or 7.
And they might be from different times and different cultures around the world. But it's because of that fourth dimensional quality to these aspects of human nature that kind of necessitate that. Because you could very well be a low caste philosopher that sort of transcends your poverty or destitution through your enaction of virtue and morality, at least within your immediate sphere.
Right.
And then there could be a someone of a much higher caste that works as a more managerial role, not as necessarily the leading aspect of that higher caste. It's all very tumultuous because of the whims and needs of men kind of intersect with each other.
Yeah, there's this idea a lot of the time that spiritual caste kind of combines with the physical birth, and a lot of times it does. A lot of times you can see this hereditary element in different relationships, but I think as time goes on, as things get more and more convoluted, you'll find that there are people of different castes that exist within the same social situation. I don't think we can look at modernity as a good example of the caste system, especially when speaking metaphysically, because there's just no consideration for the function of the caste itself. So you could very well be born into a worker class family right now, but be of that priestly preordainment, predisposition, and you can have that path ahead of you. You know what I mean? It's because of this convolution.
I think it is still applicable to modern society. It's just that in our first world nations of Western democracies and such, we like to imagine that castes and classes don't exist anymore, that everyone is equal and egalitarian
I don't
society.
mean that. I mean more so like...
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I meant like spiritually speaking, like the function of the priest isn't actually what is in the place of the function of the priest right now. So like at the top, you would have people who are of the merchant caste metaphysically, but physically and temporally, they're in that position of higher caste, if that makes sense. That's why I say there's a lot of overlap.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's yeah. That's a little where I was trying to go with it. It was definitely the more physical manifestation of that spiritual nature of things, where people still will try to ignore that it's a thing altogether, but the manifestation still comes abound, even within our own quote egalitarian societies, because that metaphysical aspect of their soul kind of still exists regardless, and so they'll naturally drift towards that status in society, and a whole bunch of different things we blamed for these differences amongst different demographics because of the spiritual nature of these different peoples altogether. And you'll have everything from racism to classism to sexism to more or less cope with these lies that the fourth estate have been feeding themselves and feeding the populations overall.
Right. Anyways, so I will start with outlining, I guess, the various castes in different societies. So the most prominent caste system was the one in India from in the ages.
Which is more or less still in place.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's more or less still in place. I was just going to say it is still kind of a thing today. It's a little wishy-washy now in regards to its actual function, but it still is there as an idea that people grow up with understanding. But yeah, so India had this idea of the Brahmin, or the priest, the warrior, which I can't pronounce for the life of me, and then below that was obviously the merchant type of like the middle management type of ordeal, and then below that was the labor caste or the slave caste, and so in each of these you have people who are dispositioned for various things, and at the top you have the Brahmin priest caste. These were people who were disposed to understand the sacred texts and things like that, and govern based upon the wisdom of the elders and the wisdom of the texts and the wisdom of their own type sort of divine interpretation, and structure society in that manner. And the warriors obviously were the ones who embodied that. They were the temporal authority, who embodied that interpretation. And then the merchants were obviously the ones who kept the whole nation afloat in the economic sense, and then obviously the laborers were the ones who kept it afloat in the physical sense. They were very physically dispositioned people. And India had the most rigid of the caste systems. It was very hard to get out of the social conditions in which one was born. And so this kind of translates over to their spiritual interpretation of the system. But a couple of other systems that were of this same type was, number one was the Greek caste system, in which there are not 4, but only three elements to it.
Depending on the city-state.
Yeah, depending on the city-state, yeah. But I believe Plato himself talked about there are those who think, as he uses an analogy of the human body. There are those who think, and there are those who rule, and then there are those who work. I believe that's how it was. Those who think, those who fight, and those who work. I think were the three, which are expressive of. Obviously the priestly caste at the head, the body is supposed to be the fighting element, the warrior caste, and then the feet are supposed to be the more of the material labor caste, the more craftsman type caste.
Mm-hmm.
And then in Europe, in medieval Europe, you had about 5, and there was this relationship between spiritual authority and temporal power that Guénon was kind of talking about in the book that I was quoting. There was a weird dichotomy between the two, depending on where you went. Sometimes the church was on top, and sometimes the king was on top. And it just really depends on the situation. But there are those two functions at the top of most European societies, and then below that there are the lords or the merchants as well, and then below them are the serfs, and then below them are the slaves. And the difference between the serf and a slave, to my understanding, was that a slave was destined to not move up, or at the very least not move up a lot, whereas a serf could become a knight given enough time and enough energy put into that goal, and a knight could become a lord. There was a little bit more social mobility for everybody except the slave caste. But that is another example of the 5 castes, or of the caste system. But what these all have in common is that there is a ruler, or there is a
ruling class.
There is a ruling class, which in proper hierarchies corresponds to the priest caste. There is an executive class, which corresponds to the warrior caste. There is an economic class, which kind of corresponds to the merchant class, and there is a labor caste, which is corresponding to the slaves, workers, commoners, whatever you would say. And let's see, I believe there was one more, but I read somewhere that I
actually wanted to add on to that, because those 4 were what I've kind of crafted myself in a bit what Praxia tries to lay down in doctrinally.
Yeah.
As these things. And it's the elite, the citizenry, the subject, and the slave. And going by just the names of them all, they're kind of self-explanatory. But the slave, I think, is the most important one to highlight, because people want to pretend that a slave class doesn't exist in society anymore because of the political abolition of slavery, where it's the bondage or ownership of a person by another person. And while politically that might have happened, realistically it has stayed the same as ancient societies have always had it. It's just become more nefarious in a way because it's been hidden. It's obscured from public view.
Yeah.
And that's mostly through that financial manipulation of this fourth estate, this ruling merchant class of people that utilize that soft power to subjugate the masses into this spiritual slavery.
Yeah. Yeah, it is true. Because even So Julius Evola wrote something on the matter as well, where he said something along the lines of, oh man, you know what? I have to go pull it up and read it because it was actually a really good quote and it fits in right here. So I'm gonna pull it up.
In the meantime, though, I will say that look into things like debt slavery and the systems in which our finances are based and the influences that subjugate our political classes to manipulate the masses in these financial means. Because you'll have everything from your local bank to the Federal Reserve or whatever central banking system your nation might use, the rate at which inflation and interests is accrued and things like that. It's all these different methods of usury, more or less, which as far back as Aristotle himself pointed out that usury is the most offensive means of wealth acquisition, which he outlined in Politics. And all men kind of agree to this fact, that we see this same resentment of usury today in careers like Wall Street or the manifestations of that in Wall Street.
Right.
Because it's all of these people just acquiring and accumulating wealth off of interest and using other people's money to just make more money out of thin air.
Right. So I have the quote here now, but what's funny is that this quote actually kind of corresponds to the caste conversation that we're talking about too. But he said, if the modern world has disproved of the quote-unquote injustice of the caste system, it has stigmatized much more vibrantly those ancient civilizations that practiced slavery. Recent times boast of having championed the principle of quote-unquote human dignity. This too is mere rhetoric. Let us set aside the fact that Europeans reintroduced and maintained slavery up to the 19th century in their overseas colonies in such heinous forms as to be rarely found in the ancient world. What should be emphasized is that if there ever were a civilization of slaves on a grand scale, the one in which we are living is it. No traditional civilization ever saw such great masses of people condemned to perform shallow, impersonal, automatic jobs. In the contemporary slave system, the counterparts of figures such as lords or enlightened rulers are nowhere to be found. The slavery is imposed subtly through the tyranny of the economic factor and through the absurd structures of a more or less collectivized society. And since the modern view of life and its materialism has taken away from the single individual any possibility of bestowing upon his destiny a transfiguring element and seeing in it a sign and a symbol, contemporary slavery should therefore be reckoned as one of the gloomiest and most desperate kinds of all time. It is not a surprise that in the masses of modern slaves, the obscure forces of world subversion have found an easy, obtuse instrument to pursue their goals. While in the places where it has already triumphed, the vast Stalinist work camps testify to how the physical and moral subjection of man to the goals of collectivization and of the uprooting of every value of the personality is employed in a magnification and even satanic way. So that's kind of what he has to say about slavery in the modern day. But it does correspond to what you're saying, especially when it comes to the economic factor, because we are living in a time where the poverty gap is getting a lot bigger than it ever was before. Even in pre-revolution France, the poverty, like the wealth gap between the king and the serfs was less than it is between you and I and Jeff Bezos right now. So I
was just going to mention that. Yeah.
So there is a huge distinction. It's just we are given this illusion of the ability of choice. And
the even crazier thing is at least that the wealth between the king and the royal class of France, between the French peasant, at least that wealth was real. There were actual coffers filled with things like jewels and gold and whatever else. The virtual wealth that these billionaires and higher financial elites of our times have today is all fake money. If any of them tried to manifest this money in the shares that they hold of whatever companies or assets that they have, it there wouldn't be enough money in the entire world to fill the bank accounts of these people. Yeah, and it's insane that we're operating on such a system where this lie of monetary value can exist at all, but it be given legitimacy. It's so unnatural in a way, and it's just like shocking to see that we've come to such a state. But like I mentioned with that Hesiod quote, both gods and men are angry at those who are idle, and modern society is nothing but idle men.
Yeah, exactly. But kind of getting back on track to the caste thing, just to kind of close it up, and we'll talk about the different political systems, because that will be an interesting conversation as well. Let's see. I'll read from this chapter here. He says, the most complete type of caste hierarchy, the ancient Indo-Aryan system, was visibly inspired by the hierarchy of the various functions found in physical organisms animated by the spirit. At the lower level of such an organism, there are the undifferentiated and impersonal energies of matter and of mere vitality. The regulating action of the functions of the metabolism and of the organism is exercised upon these forces. These functions, in turn, are regulated by the will, which moves and detects the body as an organic whole in space and time. Finally, we assume the soul to be the center, the sovereign power, and the light of the entire organism. The same is true for the castes. The activities of the slaves or workers were subordinated to the activities of the bourgeoisie. Higher up in the hierarchy, we find the warrior nobility, and finally the representatives of the spiritual authority and power, which were the Brahmin or the priest caste. And these groups were arranged in a hierarchy that corresponds to the hierarchy of the functions within a living organism. And so, let's see, off of that, I will read this last part because it is an interesting consideration to make of ancient societies. What upsets modern sensitivity the most about the caste system is the law of heredity and preclusion. It seems unfair that fate may seal at birth one's social status and predetermine the type of activity to which a man will consecrate the rest of his life, and which he will not be able to abandon, not even in order to pursue an inferior one, lest he become an outcast. When seen against the background of the traditional view of life, however, these difficulties are overcome. The closed caste system was based on two fundamental principles. The first principle consisted of the fact that traditional man considered everything visible and worldly as the mere effects of causes of a higher order. Thus, for example, to be born according to this or that condition, as a man or a woman, or in one caste rather than in another, in one race rather than in another, and to be endowed with specific talents and dispositions was not regarded as pure chance. All of these circumstances were explained by traditional man as corresponding to the nature of the principle embodied in an empirical self, whether willed or already present transcendently in the act of undertaking human birth. Such is one of the aspects of the Hindu doctrine of karma, although this doctrine does not correspond to what is commonly meant by reincarnation. It still implies the generic idea of the pre-existence of causes and the principle that human beings are heirs of karma. Similar doctrines are not typical of the East alone. So according to a Hellenistic teaching, not only quote unquote, the soul's quality exists before any bodily life, it has exactly what it chose to have, but also the body has been organized and predetermined by the image of the soul which is in it. So there's this idea of predetermination, especially in ancient societies that had this caste system, and whether or not this is a predetermination by heredity or a predetermination by birth, either or, there is a predetermination in the form of a spirit which takes control of a body. And so whether or not there is or whether or not this is aligned with, as we say, whether or not this spontaneous alignment occurs between someone who is born with a disposition and the disposition itself, it still is there. And so the propriety of the situation would be to maintain that alignment in some way. So that's kind of the idea of castes and how we look at it with the Praxis perspective.
Yeah, and I guess to just put a bow on this, in regards to this escaping of your necessary caste, I have two examples, especially in regards to the slave caste as well. One being Frederick Douglass, one being Spartacus. the former was born into slavery, and that was meant to be his fate, as is described by what Vincent just wrote, and the other was found to be a slave under circumstance. Spartacus, I believe, was taken as a prisoner of war and forced to fight in gladiatorial combat. But both earned their freedom through the will and manifestation of their spirit, because they transcended the caste they were brought into. And so
you just reminded me of something. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay. And so Frederick Douglass was able to escape the slavery he was born into, and not only manifest himself to be this intellectual titan that formed much of the American diaspora in the late 18th or the late 19th century, but also ended up living as a wealthier man, even among the white citizenry of the United States, which was incredibly difficult for someone of his complexion and status to have done. But because of his spirit guiding him to do so, he lived as the caste he was meant to be through the actualization of his will. So there's kind of an initiatory aspect to that. And likewise with Spartacus, he led himself and his group of contemporary fighters into freedom. They earned their way to freedom in this rebellion they had, and fighting their way through all the odds being thrown against them. And it's this actualization of spirit, not to sit idly in what you are given, but to manifest what you ought to be. And there's limits to the reality on what you ought to be, but you should always be striving towards that ought, because if you do achieve it, and you'll never fully achieve it, but you'll get close, you'll live a life truly worth living. And that's a bit what Aristotle expresses throughout his entire collection of writings in politics.
Yeah, you just reminded me of the there's a later section in that same chapter. I can't find it for the life of me, but there's a later section in that same chapter that talks about people who do transcend their caste in certain circumstances, and it really is so they are considered to be beyond castes at that point. If there is an apparition of the will, so to speak, to transcend that type of caste and escape it, not by rejecting it, but by embracing a higher nature, by maintaining some kind of continuity between you and a will towards something unexplainable, but almost divine in a sense. That would be a transcendence of the caste. It would be someone who kind of frees themselves from the restriction of caste. And so Frederick Douglass and Spartacus those were two good examples of people who kind of did do that in a sense. But so getting back to the different forms of government, so Aristotle outlined 3 forms of government which have either a proper or an improper form. And so one would be royalty, which is the
rule of one.
Yeah. And there's aristocracy, which is the rule of a few. And then there's constitutional government or republicanism or something of that sort, which is obviously
the rule of the many.
Yeah. So royalty in its proper form corresponds to Plato's idea of the Philosopher King, where it's an absolute singular ruler. And in its improper form, it translates... in its proper form, it corresponds to a single executive ruler who is just, who is kind, who manifests the characteristics of justice as explained in both the Republic and in politics. It would be that...
Like the medieval conception of the divine right of king.
Exactly. Or, that would actually be the best way of putting it. Someone who is just, someone who manifests that principle would be the best and proper form of royalty. And then the proper form of aristocracy would be, of course, that same idea, but applied to a few people, applied to a certain nobility who have a certain respect for each other, have a certain behavioral propriety to them, and are stand-up citizens and representatives of their community at large. And then the proper form of constitutional government or republicanism or such would be the masses that are very obviously a lot larger in quantity than the other two. And so the improper forms of all of these, he references royalty. The improper form of royalty would be tyranny.
Just before we get onto that, though.
Go ahead.
All of these proper forms, the royalty, aristocracy, and constitution, are predicated upon the scale of your society, but on the quality thereof of the men within. And it's the virtuous that are at the top of society. Royalty being the king as the most virtuous man of his kingdom or his principality or fiefdom, whatever it may be. But it's a much smaller community than would be something that would prop up many virtuous men, which would then lead into aristocracy, so that there's not a power struggle between one person saying they have claim to the throne over the other through their virtues or through some divine right. It is a cooperation of the most virtuous men in society, which may oversee different aspects of society, so that the scale of which this governance is over has been expanded. And then a constitution would predicate that many men have this virtue about them and cooperate necessarily in all aspects of things through a communal means, and they follow the guidelines of this constitution, which they can all agree upon, by virtue of them being virtuous.
Right. And I guess another thing to say is that they're not exclusive. They are not mutually exclusive, especially in function. You can see, if you look at history especially, you see a various mix of these three forms of government in they could be differentiated by locality or by a certain formal tradition of a given people, or by circumstance, but no one of these is improper because they are all the proper form of the political principle when applied, if that makes sense. The political principle manifests. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but that's what we've tried to solve with our conception of decentralized centralization, where it kind of takes all three of these aspects and puts them in their best suited positions, so that there is a natural ebb and flow of power and dictation in society that feels the most natural and can be applied at any scale.
Exactly. It's a hierarchical structure that is replicated at each tier, and within each tier there are various forms of each of the governments, or each of the government types outlined by Aristotle here. But I guess to give some examples, the medieval kingships are a good one to point to, because you have a great mix of all three within them. So you have obviously the main, the Holy Roman Empire is a good example. You have the royalty in the emperor, and then you have the aristocracy in the nobility, who doesn't necessarily contradict the emperor himself, but is more so of his, I don't want to say henchmen, but that's the first word that came to mind.
They work in cooperation with the emperor, but are independent of the emperor.
Yeah. And then you do have these more localized republic-type governments, which are usually only found in places like small towns or merchant cities and things like that. It's not necessarily it is kind of contradictory to the principle of nobility, but not if it's done correctly. And there were a few instances in which it was done correctly, but this type of government would be characterized as, I would say best, you could look at the old Western towns in early America, with the communal appreciation that each person had for each other, and the cooperation that they acted with by being kind of a semi-sovereign town, more or less. That would be the best example, I think, of this Republican-type government working on a small scale. And then the inverse of all of these, obviously, they have improper forms as well. So the improper manifestation of the political principle would be... so royalty translates over to tyranny improperly. So that would be tyranny of the ruler. It would be a single dictatorship, really, a negative dictatorship. I like to stress that dictatorship is more so. It's a word that is like oligarchy, where it does have a bad connotation to it because it is connected to certain bad individuals.
Aristocracy instead of oligarchy.
Or yeah. Well, no, I guess both of those in a sense, but I reference the word dictatorship. I use a kind of a neutral tone because all it does mean is the rule of one, and so the Philosopher King himself could be a very good dictator, but the tyrant could be a very bad dictator, and so I think using this term exclusively to mean something negative is it kind of hinders our speech, and so I like to use it neutrally, if that makes sense, because it really is like Julius Caesar was appointed a dictator, and really dictator just means the speaker, in a sense. So I use that word kind of loosely, but the tyrant would be that archetypal dictator that we see obviously in today's society, that Stalinist type, very negative figure who executes. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add on the singular person that acts within their own self-interest, someone who will execute their own court if they suspect some sort of challenge to their power or authority, even if it's not there.
Yeah.
Like many might point to the examples of people like Caligula or Nero as tyrants of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, Caligula is an anomaly in himself. He's a very interesting figure. But yes, that is two good examples. Leopold, I believe his name was, of Belgium is another one.
Abraham Lincoln could be seen as a tyrant as well. Absolutely.
Yeah. Anyways, so we also have the aristocracy principle, the principle of aristocracy, translated in an improper fashion over to oligarchy, which is the second form of government that Aristotle references, which is a small number of people kind of acting in a negative way, kind of like a tyrant would, but it would be just a more decentralized type of tyranny with the lowercase t.
They're all within their own self-interest, but they'll cooperate so long as their power is all within the benefit of that cooperation.
Exactly.
Like I mentioned before, it's our system, at least in the U.S., operates much on an oligarchy where we have these political dynasties or these long-reigning politicians that sit in office for decades at a time, even, that enrich themselves off of these backroom deals and lobbying and so on and so forth, whether they be elected or appointed to, say, a cabinet position or some federal agency. They'll use these levers of power within our body politic to then affect their riches and the wealth that they extort off the people instead of ensuring that the people can enrich themselves. That's kind of the tyranny of oligarchy.
And then the third form of government, the constitutional type of Republican-esque government, is, believe it or not, Aristotle references the inverted or improper form of this as democracy, or as the rule of the masses, or as the rule of the majority, even. Because tyranny of the majority is a big proponent in the problem that most democracies face, in that an uneducated majority can superimpose their will upon a very educated and even good-hearted and good-willed minority, which is very it's it's kind of reminiscent of the various stages that we've seen our society undergo. As we talked about earlier, more and more things become open to the more and more things become open to participate in, but they aren't necessarily morally good. They aren't necessarily good things for people to be participating in, but enough people have wanted it to the point where it is now a thing. And that's kind of the problem with democracy. And so he references that as the worst, or not as the worst, the best. Not the best. What the hell am I saying? The improper form of constitutional government.
Yeah, democracy more or less would be like the disarming of everyone for the benefit of the many, because those few who are exceptional will exert their will over the many, which is what your example of the classroom kind of brought as well, where democratically everyone will vote out that which is unpleasurable, even if it is necessary, and that is the mob rule of the masses in democracy, and why it is ineffective and will deteriorate rapidly, which I'd say probably opens it up for the lowest lifespan of the three, because a tyrant, so long as he's smart, can survive as long as he lives. Oligarchy, kind of the same thing, could probably survive the longest out of all of them, as we see with the American political system and how it's translated elsewhere in the world. Democracy opens it up very quickly to outside forces exploiting that chaos of the mob, or an internal direction of someone like a Caesarian figure coming in and seizing power, so that the chaos is brought to an end.
Yeah, most tyrants do arise out of democracy, which is kind of funny.
Yeah, it is.
But these things all kind of work in tandem with each other. I think you can see the manifestation of this also in places like the Soviet Union, where a tyrant like Stalin was disposed by an oligarchy that ruled the Soviet Union for the rest of its existence. So the oligarchy did survive longer than the tyrant. But as soon as it opened up to more democratic means, it did collapse. And the same thing
severely weakened the state. Yes.
Yeah, and the same thing has kind of happened with the United States. We can see that as it's kind of opened up from being a republican aristocracy, you would see the in early America, it was kind of a aristocratic type republic where landowners would be the only ones who were able to participate in voting, and voting was done in such a way where it was done through a council, and it was done through it was very difficult, to say the least, and so only a small few could actually qualify to do it, and these few were largely considered to be the smartest and the most well-mannered of men, and
not only that, but the most well-armed too, because Aristotle brings up the point that the warrior classes, by means of having this force of violence, that violence being the ultimate authority, will always necessarily rule over an aristocracy in this form. I think that the in between of oligarchy and democracy being a plutocracy, or something similar to that word. I might have gotten that wrong, but
you're right.
Yeah, that would be taken over by a sort of military coup, more or less, just because they have the means of force to do so. But the founding fathers were clever in that everyone should have equal reigns of self-defense and armament, just in the case of one of these forms of government popping up and then delegitimizing or eroding the foundations of authority which they wanted American society to stand upon. And what do you know? They were right.
Yeah, and so the Aristotle outlined these different conceptions in order of which he preferred them, versus in order of which they were bad for the inverse. So a proper royalty is the best form of government for Aristotle. He suggested that the Philosopher King was the best type of government. And I tend to agree. I think that a Philosopher King who knows what he's doing, is an executive, powerful figure, is probably the best form of government. Obviously, this is likely not going to be the case.
A good king is decisive, and you don't have to try and unmuddy the waters when disagreement arises in something like an aristocracy. It's just what I say goes. Here's hopefully in the best interest of the people, much like what we see with Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
As pragmatic as they may be, they very much understand the politic, capital P, of their positions. And you could more or less call them a democratic royalty because they act as kings within their nation within the bounds of the constitutions that they've arisen in those states.
I would call them a lot more of Machiavellian figures as well, which is something I think we could get into after this, is Machiavelli's Prince, because that's it's a very relevant book to the discussion that we're talking about today, I think. So Aristotle suggested that royalty was the best form of proper government. And then after that, he suggested that the next best, or the second best, was aristocracy, the rule of few. And then after that, he suggested that obviously the worst form of government would be the rule of the masses in the form of a constitutional, limited, either Republican or Democratic Republican or something of that sort, that type of government. But on the inverse side, when these things become perverted and improper, he suggested that democracy was the best one to deal with. It's best to deal with democracy as a bad form of government than it is to deal with oligarchy, which is the next worst, and then tyranny, which is the worst form of inverted governments. So there's a thin line to tread, because if you want a really good government, it's gonna flip flop into a really bad one. If you want a mediocre one, it's gonna flip flop into another mediocre one. And if you want a really good or really bad government, it's gonna flip flop into a really good situation at the inverse side of things. So it's kind of the trade off that he made. Go ahead.
We kind of explained how that happens too before.
Yeah.
We got into Aristotle's delineation, which I guess good on us for being premonitious in that aspect.
Yeah. But I think that the idea of his hierarchy or positionings of government, more or less, is a good way of looking and categorizing these various principles. But in reality, like I said before, I don't think that these are exclusive, especially not in our modern day, and especially not throughout history. You definitely had a royalty, a dynasty, usually on top of an aristocracy, which was also on top of some kind of peasant or plebeian government at the lowest tiers, which usually operated as a democracy. And I think that to decide the policy, which is actually another thing I wanted to get into. So politics and policy have the same root word of polis, which is the city-state in Greece. But politics, especially now, kind of corresponds to policy, because I will actually read something from Evola that quotes kind of our position on this as well. But the differentiation between law and policy is what goes as such. Let's see. The traditional society's view of both the law and the state is closely related to the order of ideas that I've been discussing so far. Generally speaking, a transcendent realism is the presupposition for the traditional notion of the law. The notion of the law has an intimate relationship with the notions of truth, reality, and stability inherent to that which is. Thus, the word of the law, and consequently of the state, came to be equated with the word of truth and of reality in the eminent sense of the words. As a natural consequence, traditional man either ignored or considered absurd the idea that one could talk about laws and the obedience due them if the laws in question had a mere human origin, whether individual or collective. Every law, in order to be regarded as an objective law, had to have a divine character. Once the divine character of a law was sanctioned and its origin traced back to a non-human tradition, then its authority became absolute. This law became something inflexible, infallible, immutable, blah, blah, blah. Thus, every transgression of such a law was not regarded so much as a crime against society, but rather and foremost as sacrilege or as an act of impiety, or as an act that jeopardized the spiritual destiny of the person who disobeyed it, as well as the people with whom that person was socially related. That is why, up to and including medieval civilization, rebellion against authority and the imperial law was considered as serious a crime as religious heresy. Thus the rebels were considered just like heretics, namely as the enemies of their own natures and as beings who contradict the law of their very own being. So that's the idea with which we operate, or that's the attitude with which we approach the idea of the law, which operates under those presuppositions. So modern politics is so convoluted. That's why I say politics in the Kali Yuga, because again, traditional politics, our form of supported political ideas, relates closely to that order of things, where the law is this unchangeable and immutable reality, which is something that is kind of discovered and interpreted rather than something that is made up or built from the ground up. I guess the default is law rather than the default is anarchy in that kind of worldview. Obviously, this is it would need to be discovered, it would need to be understood, but it is kind of that common sense intuition type of thing for the law. Whereas in modern politics, law is regarded as policy. So I'll separate the law, because we live in, I would say, lawless times. If you define law as the definition I kind of just read, we do live in lawless times. There is no law whatsoever understood by the populace. And so, oh, no problem. But yeah, we do live in lawless times. There's no law as concrete or as stable as the one I just referenced now. But there is still legislative laws. There is still a political law. There are still policies in function. And modern politics really does pertain to the creating and deleting of policies. And at the root of both of these words is the word polis. So politics now does correspond to policy. It doesn't really correspond to law. And that's kind of the idea with which that's kind of the attitude with which I approach modern political discussions, is by understanding that with the notion of the law destroyed, with the inversion of the castes kind of upon us, right? The last stage of the inversion of the castes upon us, where it almost seems like it's going further. We have only matters of policy now. And that's why I refrain a lot from engaging in political conversations when it comes to the subject of the day, because it is mere policy. If you don't come from the frame of reference that we're coming from here, with the idea of the notion of the law being this absolute truth, this absolute reality with which we must obey, because every tradition has in common with another tradition the fact that there is a law that must be obeyed and a way that must be followed, both exoteric and esoteric functions of the tradition itself. But that's why I don't engage in political discussions today when it regards to policy. But back then that was not obviously so much the case. But with this idea that politics in the Kali Yuga is this immoral and almost anarchistic area of it's almost this anarchistic battleground of various forces which are all equated on the same plane, all morally the same. Like I said earlier, the doctrine of the strong. It is not
this
Yeah, go ahead.
postmodern ideal. It's the postmodern ideal of everything being subjective, that even the immutable laws that which our nations were founded on could be just hand waved away as policy and mere suggestions that can be changed, even though they are fundamental to our societies. Things like the Bill of Rights that the founders of the United States wrote as immutable laws that which limit the government are now being put up to threat under being changed or thrown out altogether because of the fundamental misunderstanding or just involution or devolution of politics as policy, like you've described.
Yeah.
It is this growing chaos.
Well, even as far back as the founders, the mistake made there was giving the ability to change it later on. It was that lack of confidence in the law itself to be absolute in its own right that caused kind of the spiraling or snowballing effect that we're seeing today with that. Not saying that wouldn't have been changed later on, anyways, but it's the fact that it was a thing in the first place that we see, like that little seed that was planted that kind of sprouted out into the tree. But it is this playing field of politics today, especially in the Kali Yuga, in the age of darkness, in the age of relativity, subjectivity, and temporal power, that the doctrine of Machiavelli is probably the most important, which the Prince is Machiavelli's magnum opus, right? It's his main work. And this is an outline of the way in which a prince, or a leader, I guess you could say, regardless of morality, needs to behave to maintain his power. It's basically a guide to power. That's what this is. And I would recommend that people read it because it is true. The problem is it doesn't correspond to morality, and the thing is, it doesn't have to. That's
very, very pragmatic. And
yeah.
I've read it myself and taken notes on it, which we might publish later.
I think we should do a video on
the
it.
launching of our website. Yeah.
Yeah.
What was that you said though?
Oh, I said I think we should I might do a video analysis on it or something later on.
Mm-hmm.
I think that'd be a good idea. But oh, go ahead.
The Sovereign, or the Prince that Machiavelli wrote, is just one of his works as well. He does have many others that he's written on things like democracy and how to maintain a democratic system and other forms of government and finance, because he was a hired philosopher, I guess, for the Medicis, which we've mentioned previously in other episodes, and their influence and their example of rule throughout society and finance and so on. And much of their success is accredited to Machiavelli for being so honest and pragmatic in a time where men were still expected to uphold the virtues above just the pragmatic reality. There was still the aspiration of transcendence. Even if it wasn't being followed, it still was like there mentally in the minds of society. And Machiavelli comes around to this very hard reality of men in politics that hadn't been seen since Aristotle.
Yeah. And so the idea of Machiavellianism, especially in the Kali Yuga, I reference this because in a moralless time, it is necessary for the moral to take the same steps as the immoral would take to get into power, so that they can stop the immoral from getting into that position. That's almost the entirety of the political philosophy of Praxism. Like our like interpreting this idea politically is, or at least in the current day, is in a sense understanding Machiavellianism, understanding the doctrine of righteousness and of the strong, and kind of uniting these two together in one common principle, which doesn't necessarily mean that the political principle in itself needs to be held in the highest regard. But what it does mean is that you need to understand and maneuver not just the political sphere as it would be referenced in general conversation, but the social sphere, the community sphere, and try to impose a more just path for people to be able to take. At the very least, offer an alternative to the evil and other stuff, that, like the evil and the negative effects that the world is imposing on people today, to offer an alternative path to that. Machiavellianism is... Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. And it is a very dangerous razor's edge to walk as well, because in that pursuit of power and in acquiescence of authority in society, it's very easy to lose yourself and the vision that you hold in opposing or correcting this evil or this dangerous rule of the oligarchies, the tyrants, the democracies that have been festering and subverting our civilizations. And you might very well become the thing you sought to destroy.
Exactly.
And that's always the conscious warning that we give ourselves, and that everyone should remind themselves in that pursuit of that higher goal. Because it's the Machiavelli's principles don't just apply to the political realm as well, but in the self-actualization of your own power, your own manifestation of will in control of yourself as well.
Yeah. Now, I have written before that the only moral pursuit of power is that in which there is an orientation towards a continuity between that spontaneous action and the disposition to which it is oriented. So if there's an orientation towards an alignment between a spontaneous action and a metaphysical function, that would be the only moral pursuit of power, and a sense of duty held by the actor to uphold a virtuous morality and to seek and subdue and prevent decadence or evildoers from coming to power. So what this means is that obviously sometimes it is going to be a morally gray area, and sometimes it's going to be very utilitarian, very pragmatic, very consequentialist in certain regards. But I think dealing with unjustness consequentialistically, not consequentially, but in a consequentialist manner, in a utilitarian manner, dealing with unjustness and evil and other of these broad various topics that we talk about. It does require a lot of pragmatism, utilitarianism, and consequentialism. And so that's the doctrine of Machiavelli. And the reason for this is because if you succumb to your own morality, you by being passive and idle, like that quote that you said, there are other people who will not succumb to that same morality and usurp you and use your power, or use that power for evil when you would have used it for good. I think that's what it boils down to. And this doesn't mean that this doesn't always mean
abandon.
Yeah, exactly. And it also doesn't mean to strictly pursue political positions. What it means is to keep in your mind what is correct and what is proper, and to pursue a position of power so that you can be that stable center for other people to go and kind of rally behind even.
It's always the approximation of virtue. And what I was saying is not to abandon those principles that are meant to guide you. It's just to face the reality that sometimes principles can't be absolute, because if they were, they'd be self-defeating in the face of an overwhelming force of will.
Right.
Say by a source of corruption or chaos or that tyrannical strongman, as we've mentioned. And like we said, the only way that you can hold these principles in absolute is by some miracle of divinity. Like we mentioned with Jesus. the only way he did transcend those aspects of man's nature is because he was himself divine and this perfect conception of virtue in full actualization. No mortal man can do that. That's why you have to have that level of pragmatism alongside your principle, so that you can navigate and survive.
Yeah, and sometimes it's a toss between the bad option and the worst one. It really, sometimes there is not a good option for you to take if you are going to survive, and that's the problem with trying to impose those utopianistic ideas without considering the limitations of physical reality and things like that as well. And so that's why I understand the people who come to the position of the doctrine of the strong. But I think one conclusion I've made while we were talking about this stuff is that the doctrine of the strong is really the doctrine of the manipulative. It's who can manipulate the most. And
which is the fourth estate's modus operandi.
Exactly. But the strong can manipulate things by strength. But really, if they are overtaken by the fox, it isn't necessarily a feat of strength. It's a feat of maneuvering. It's a feat cunning. Exactly. Yes, and it is the art of politic, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a good place to end, unless you guys have.
I think this was a really good discussion. We kind of outlined some things here. I touched upon pretty much all of the things I wanted to touch upon.
Oh yeah, same here.
All right, good. Well, I guess that is it for today's episode. I'd like to thank everyone again for joining us for this week's Praxist Table Talk. Thank you once again, Cody.
As always.
And thank you once again, Goji.
Yep.
My name is Vincent, and I will see you next time at the Praxist Table Talks.